within law enforcement, but we also have some good ones. And it's utter foolishness for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And like I'm sure everyone in this hearing today, my heart broke in the appalling video of Mr. Floyd's death, those last few moments of his life. I don't know that I'll ever quite get over that. And I was reminded in the aftermath of it all personally, one of my great American heroes that I love. In fact, I've just read a biography, is Frederick Douglass. And in his book, he actually made the statement that anyone who claims to love America cannot sweep our national sins under the rug. He made a statement similar to that. That's not a quote, but that is the essence of his statement. And I fully agree with him. Uh, we must fight the wrongs of racism in this country, but undermining and or eliminating America's law enforcement is not the answer. Uh, the vast majority of law enforcement officers throughout this country are great, upstanding servants in their communities. And in fact, in the wake of Mr. Floyd's death, hundreds of police officers have been injured across this country, and several have lost their lives. And yet we have cities like Los Angeles, New York, Minneapolis, who are literally seriously considering defunding police departments at this time, and even to the extent of totally disbanding police departments. And so I just call on our colleagues across the aisle for all of us to fight racism. I believe that we can and we must fight racism and at the same time support our law enforcement. We can do both. We should do both. And I believe this is a time that we need to come together as a country and restore the bonds of faith in God and our love for one another. And this type of rhetoric of disbanding and going after law enforcement agencies, I believe, does more harm and drives a wedge, driving us further apart. So, no question, we are at a historic point in our nation. And as it relates to the coronavirus itself, since the beginning of this virus, the benchmark for reopening has been and was, we were clearly told, ensuring that we must flatten the curve so that our hospital systems would not be overwhelmed. As a result, the economy came to a screeching halt. We united as a nation. We stayed home. We flattened the curve and we succeeded. And now at this point, the U.S. has secured adequate capacities in our hospitals, and hospitalizations for COVID-19 related illnesses continues to decline all across the country. The Trump administration is on track to procure some 200,000 ventilators by the end of the year. And we also have over 200,000 ventilators available in the Strategic National Stockpile. So while the previous administration left us unprepared, the Trump administration is making us stronger than ever. And states are beginning to reopen the economy in order to help communities that have been horribly impacted. In some instances, businesses we all know and individual lives ruined because of the shutdowns. The loss of economic output in the U.S. alone is estimated to be 5% of the country's gross domestic profit. That's $1.1 trillion for every month that we are shut down. The unemployment rate hit a record 14.7% in April, with over 40 million people filing for unemployment. However, last month, as states began to reopen, last month the economy added 2.5 million jobs, and some states are totally open for business. I think the rest of the country has to follow suit. In addition to the financial impact, health experts agree in telling us that prolonged shutdowns like we have seen results in a wide range of health issues, including things like suicide and mental health, domestic violence, substance abuse, uh, reluctance to go to the doctors for needed health care issues. So there's fiscal issues, there's physical issues, there's mental health issues, and we must come to the point now of reopening our economy, reopening our businesses. And yet, to be honest, here we are. While so much of the country is returning to work, here we are, many of us here in Washington, having this hearing while Speaker Pelosi and our House Democrats continue to stay at home, holding virtual hearings. We have got to get back to doing the real live work that the American people sent us here to do. And I just urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to come back to Washington and do what we have been elected to do. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Heiss. Now we'll introduce our witnesses. First, we have Anita Bigote, wife of Edward Bigote, an essential worker who died from coronavirus. Next, we have John Costa, who is the international president of the Amalgamated Transit Union. Next, we have Anthony Mark Perrone, who is the international president of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. We also have with us Bonnie Castillo, who is the executive director of National Nurses United, California Nurses Association, and the National Nurses Organizing Committee. We also have Clint Odom, who is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy and the Executive Director of the Washington Bureau of the National Urban League. Last but not least, we have Avik Roy, who is the President of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. The witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear them in. Please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Bigote, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Anita Bigote. I work at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York in the Pediatric Administration Department. I live in Queens with my two sons, Joshua and Brandon. I'm here today to tell you about my family and how we lost our guiding light, Edward Bigote, to COVID on April 9th. I'm also here to speak on behalf of all the families left behind so that our elected representatives know how important it is that you pass the Pandemic Heroes Compensation Act to help the families of essential workers who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country as America has been engulfed in this pandemic. First, let me tell you about my husband, Ed. Ed was one of the strongest, kindest, dedicated, and most loving person I have ever known. We met in the Brooklyn Hospital Center, where he was employed until the day he passed away. He was an incredible father and a loving husband and a best friend to anybody that crossed his path. He was just as dedicated to the patients who he served as a patient transporter for over 20 years. Ed wasn't the kind of guy who saw his job as just getting a paycheck, or he loved his job, and he at the hospital, and he felt responsible for all his patients and made sure to give every one of them the same level of care and attention that any one of us would want from our family members. He loved to tell jokes and had the biggest smile that would light up a room. He used that gift to make his patients feel comfortable as he was taking them to surgery or for tests, knowing the kind of stress and anxiety that they may be feeling at the moment. He was a loyal co-worker and was truly devoted to the healthcare workers of Brooklyn Hospital, serving them as an 1199 union delegate. He believed that everyone deserved to be treated fairly and with dignity. He believed that treating caregivers with respect was a vital part of providing good patient care in any healthcare setting. I used to tell him all the time he missed his calling, he should have been a lawyer. He truly loved being an advocate and brought a passion to the work that was an inspiration and example for others. We lost Ed on April 9th after he had been hospitalized with COVID for nearly 3 weeks. Over a matter of days, my strongest, energetic husband went from having a fever to being on a ventilator in the intensive care unit. I will never forget that day I got the call that he passed away. Me and my sons, our children's world has changed forever. Ed was a big presence in our lives. He was our guiding light and our protector. He's a devoted Pittsburgh Steelers fan, football coach, and a best friend. He was our rock. I pray that I can make it through the days without him, because every morning that passes by, it seems unreal that he's not here. Ed was also my partner. Together we were raising a family and building our life. We worked hard to build our dreams and give our children the things we never had. Now, not only have I lost my best friend, but I've lost a man who worked alongside me for over 20 years from building our American dream. I urge you to pass this bill, not just for us, the B Coat family, but for the tens of thousands of other families like us who not only lost their loved ones to this cruel virus, but lost the loved ones who gave so much to protect us all. In addition to supporting the families left behind, we can honor heroes like my husband by doing everything we can to stop the spread of coronavirus. We need to ensure that testing is widely available and much earlier. My husband didn't get tested until his symptoms were severe enough to put him into ICU and onto a ventilator. We also need to ensure that every healthcare worker gets the hazard pay they so rightly deserve and has access to the personal protective equipment that can help save their lives. Over these last few months, so many of the essential workers who play crucial roles in our healthcare system have gone unacknowledged. Food service workers, clerks, housekeepers, patient transporters like my husband. The best way we as a nation can show our gratitude is to make sure they remain safe and healthy and able to return home to their families that they work so hard to support. Our family members made the ultimate sacrifice. Help us honor their memories by protecting the families they left behind so we may go to help others build their own American dream. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bagote. We extend our deepest sympathies for your loss. Thank you. Now we have Mr. Costa. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Woman Maloney, Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for the opportunity to testify on HR 6909, the Pandemic Heroes Compensation Act of 2020. The ATU strongly supports the critical legislation. Transit workers need a new program for those who are injured or impacted by the coronavirus, modeled after the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund. The ATU is the largest transit union with over 200,000 members. And it's been 12 weeks now that this pandemic has been out there. And unlike others, our members have not had the opportunity to stay home and work from home. We're the workers out there that are moving the economy, keeping the cities going. And unfortunately, we are the workers that have been affected the most with the infections, which are right now over 1,000. At 12 weeks later, we still have over 1,000 confirmed corona cases, and unfortunately, 53 of our members have passed. And our concerns are it's only going to get worse as it reopens because it's obvious we're being overexposed. The sacrifices my members are making out there every day to keep the front lines moving, like we've done before in 9/11, in Sandy, Katrina. We've been out there. We know what our jobs are. We know these jobs are hard. We sit there. Our members are assaulted, are spit at, are murdered. And now we're dealing with an invisible challenge out of here, an enemy we can't see every day. And unfortunately, it's going to get worse, I believe, before it gets better. The lack of PPE, we've been dealing with many problems trying to get the PPE. We just done a survey as of now, 12 weeks later, and in the midst of reopening, 50% of our agencies do not have the proper PPE. The mishandling of this from the get-go with our government and our CDC telling us the CDC telling us we did not need masks, that certain things we didn't need and later on changed. We as the ATU believe we can't count on our government and we need to make the demands. So we have made demands of backdoor boarding, overcrowding needs to stop, and the recommendations, unfortunately, with the CDC has been ignored, and they've made changes. And unfortunately, those changes, I believe, are going to put our members in harm's way. So I urge the committee to look at this. It's funny, you call us heroes. You're calling our members heroes. But when we get to the table, we're zeros. It's just, it's crazy here. We're in negotiations right now in some areas, and we see this happening. So I hope you remember our members out there. I hope you remember our fallen, and I hope you help us keep our members safe moving forward as we open the cities that need to be open and need us out there to bring our cities back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Costa. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Perrone. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Chairwoman Maloney, as well as you, Vice Chair Gomez, and the ranking member in front of the committee today, Congressman Heiss. I'd also like to thank all the other members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on the experiences that workers in grocery, meat packing, food processing, and healthcare have had to endure during this pandemic. You know, my name is Mark Perrone. I'm the president of the UFCW International Union. The UFCW is America's largest retail and food union, representing 1.3 million hardworking men and women in the grocery stores, meat packing, food processing, healthcare, chemical plants, non-food retail, and senior care facilities. We have members that are Republican, Democrats, and independents from every state in this nation, as well as every congressional district. All across this country, our healthcare, food processing, retail food workers are risking their health and safety to ensure that the American people are taken care of. Our nation's food supply is safe. Grocery store shelves are full and stocked, and pharmacies are distributing medication. These essential workers, as many of you have called them, deserve not only our gratitude, but they deserve adequate protections and provisions for their health and safety and financial security. I'd like to highlight the words of one of our grocery clerks out of Ralph's in Southern California and San Diego. She said, every day you fear that you might catch the virus at work. You fear that you might take that virus home to your family. And we are working longer hours under very stressful conditions. Our lives are on the line. Let me stress to you how real this issue actually is. Our internal estimates have confirmed that 225 of our members have tragically died, and over 29,000 have been sick or exposed to COVID-19 since the beginning. 70 of our packing house members and workers in the U.S. have died, with over 20,000 that have tested positive to COVID-19. These profound risks that our members face is one of the reasons that we, the UFCW, supports the legislation to compensate the families of essential workers who die or hospitalized as a result of COVID-19. While financial compensation cannot bring back what's lost, it is the least that we must do in order to support the families who have worked so hard to keep us fed and to take care of us. More importantly, it's about recognizing that we will never protect America's food supply unless and until we protect America's food workers. What's making things worse is that some of these essential workers must now endure the insult of having their hero pay, and some of us have called it hazard pay, taken away even as this pandemic continues. Listen to the words of a food worker in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. We put our lives on the line every single day, and I worry about taking the virus back home to my grandchildren and my husband. And when Kroger took away the hero pay from us, it was like a slap in the face. The fact of the matter is, our customers don't wear masks, and it's putting us in jeopardy every single day. And so, as long as the spread of the virus hasn't stopped, neither should the protections or the hero pay that our families so desperately need. In other words, this brave food worker exposed this. While some responsible employers like Cargill and Safeway have done what's right, there's others like Amazon and Walmart, and even some of our union employers like Kroger has decided to put profits, quite honestly, over people. And while we can all hope that companies do what's right, the brutal reality is that many will not do that until you and our other elected leaders do more. Now, I know that legislative issues at times can be framed in a very partisan way, but this is not about being a Republican or a Democrat. This is about protecting essential workers in retail food, food processing, healthcare, as well as protecting our food supply. And that's why that I'd ask you to consider the following: ensuring that all working people who are sick, who are affected by quarantine orders, or who are responsible to take care of children who are in fact away at home because schools have been closed, should have job protections and paid sick leave for a minimum of 14 days. I'd also ask that we compel OSHA to issue enforceable rules specific to COVID-19 standards, if you will. And to date, that has not happened. And our members, especially in healthcare and food processing, are feeling the consequences from that. Enforceable rules that slow line speeds, mandate social distancing, and prioritize workers and provide PPE free of charge. Lastly, we must include strong anti-retaliation protections to ensure that all workers are protected from being unfairly threatened or fired. For the sake of this country that I know that we all love, I urge the committee and Congress to work together to do what's right for these brave workers. And I thank you again for your time, and I would welcome any questions you may have. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Now we have Ms. Castillo. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Rice, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today. National Nurses United is the largest union of registered nurses in the U.S. Our nurses are on the front lines of the COVID-19 response, risking their lives to care for patients throughout this horrific pandemic. Across the country, nurses have been denied the protections they need to prevent exposure to COVID-19. As a result, tens of thousands of healthcare workers have been infected. As of June 5th, NNU knows of at least 914 healthcare workers who have died, and of which more than 134 have been registered nurses. These deaths could have been prevented if employers had protected their workers. The moment that outbreak began, hospitals across the country started locking up their PPE, claiming that there would be future shortages. Nurses have had to fight hospital management to unlock and allow access to PPE supplies. To protect against exposure to aerosol transmissible diseases, we must be given a respirator, at minimum an N95. But instead, nurses have been forced to use surgical masks, cloth masks, or even their own bandanas and scarves. These do not provide protection against COVID-19, but the CDC has sanctioned their use through weakened guidance. Hospitals have run out of gloves, coveralls, and gowns. In New York City, nurses were forced to wear garbage bags as makeshift PPE. Even when nurses are given N95s, they are forced to reuse them, sometimes for days on end. N95s are manufactured for single use only. Nurses are at risk of exposure every time they reuse one. Hospitals have begun to use decontamination processes for these masks, even though there is no scientific evidence that these methods are safe and effective. Many hospitals require nurses to continue to work after exposure. Some have required asymptomatic nurses to work after testing positive, putting patients and colleagues at risk. Many hospitals fail to communicate suspected or confirmed COVID cases, leaving countless workers unaware of potential exposure. There are three main reasons why nurses have not been protected at work. First, there is no OSHA standard that enforces workplace protections in hospitals during a pandemic. Second, federal and state efforts to distribute PPE from stockpiles have been ineffective, and frontline workers have not seen the equipment supposedly delivered. We do not have a national medical supply chain that is coordinated, transparent, or efficient. Third, there is simply not enough stock of respirators and other necessary PPE in the country, and the Trump administration has refused to increase PPE production in the volumes required. These failures have created a deeply traumatic situation within hospitals across the country, and our nurses are dealing with that trauma every single day. Nurses live with the fear that they will become infected and pass it on to their families, friends, or patients. Many nurses are isolating away from their families. Some are sleeping in their garages or cars. At times when families need comfort, at a time when families need to comfort each other, nurses are deprived of this support. Nurses knew that the pandemic was on its way back in January. Why weren't the hospitals prepared? Why wasn't the administration or Congress prepared? Now as plans on reopening in the country are underway, our nurses face increased risk. We could see and are seeing a second wave of infections. It is critical that Congress immediately pass legislation that will protect nurses and other frontline workers. NNU applauds Chairwoman Maloney for introducing HR 6909, which would provide compensation for workers who contract COVID-19 or for our families if we die from the disease. I have personally led online heartbreaking vigils for registered nurses who have died, and I know that their families need our support. But we also need Congress to take action immediately to prevent those infections and deaths from happening in the first place. NNU applauds the House for passing the HEROES Act. The bill includes a mandate that OSHA issue an emergency temporary standard for COVID-19, as well as provisions that would ensure the Defense Production Act is fully invoked to immediately increase the domestic production of respirators and other PPE. It is essential that these provisions are included in any compromise that is negotiated with the Senate. Our country has failed to protect nurses during this pandemic. Without protections, more nurses will continue to die. On behalf of nurses across the country, I urge the members of this committee to ensure that we get the protections we need immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Castillo. Now we have Mr. Odom. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Chairwoman Maloney and Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for allowing me to testify today on behalf of the National Urban League, one of the nation's oldest civil rights organizations and direct services organizations. My long-form testimony has already been entered into the record, so I'd like to just say a few remarks. I'd like to pay tribute today to the Africans and their descendants whose labor without compensation built the U.S. Capitol, made possible the Statue of Freedom that sits atop the Capitol Dome, and made possible the rise of the United States as an economic superpower. I'd also like to lift up Ms. Breonna Taylor, an essential worker, an EMT from Louisville, Kentucky, whose life was cut short not by COVID, but by police officers serving a no-knock warrant in March. African Americans are, and have always been, among the nation's essential workers. African Americans and people of color are overrepresented in the essential workforce. Their labor feeds, cleans, and cares for us. Their labor delivers life-sustaining packages, stocks our grocery stores, transports goods and people necessary to bring this economy back from a self-induced coma. Their labor both keeps us alive and gives us dignity at life's end. Their labor allows millions of non-essential workers to be productive while remaining safe at home, with only 1 in 5 African Americans and 1 in 6 Latinx people able to work from home. Essential workers occupy frontline jobs that greatly increase their exposure to the virus. Yet we don't pay essential workers anywhere near their worth. We don't provide them with work protection and benefits necessary to survive the pandemic. Without a cure or a vaccine, essential workers often must choose between living and making a living. To date, 23,251 Black lives have been lost to COVID-19. By one estimate, 38% of African American workers are employed in essential industries. In places like New York City, however, 75% of essential workers are people of color, including 82% of cleaning services employees. Black women in particular bear the brunt of the essential worker dilemma. Black women are overrepresented in low-wage jobs, such as nursing assistants, personal care, or home health aides. When compounded with government-mandated school closures and restrictions on movement and a lack of affordable access to childcare, the stress of running a household for Black women is exacerbated. In addition, half of the Black households in this country with children are headed by single women. Of these households, 38% live below the poverty line. When exposed to the coronavirus, Blacks are hospitalized at 2.5 times the rate of whites, and nationally, African American deaths from COVID-19 are nearly 2 times greater than would be expected based on their share of the population. Blacks and Latinos are more likely to have pre-existing health conditions, such as asthma, heart disease, and diabetes, that make death from viral infection more likely. With respect to pay, essential workers are paid less than non-essential workers. Essential workers in the food and agriculture industry in particular have the lowest median hourly wage at $13.12. African Americans and other workers of color work for employers many times that do not offer health insurance, as we've heard today. Uninsured COVID-19 medical expenses can decimate families' finances. Testing alone out of network can cost as much as $1,300, while the cost of hospitalization and treatment for more severe cases of COVID-19 can cost almost $75,000 without insurance. Although workers of color are overrepresented among essential workers, they suffer from the second blow of higher unemployment rates caused by the pandemic. The CBO explained as follows. Low-wage workers and low-income families have borne the brunt of the economic crisis, in part because the industries hardest hit by the pandemic and social distancing measures disproportionately employ low-wage workers. Furthermore, workers who are young, female, have less education, and are from certain racial or ethnic groups have seen disproportionately large job losses. End of quote. So you've heard from other witnesses today about the need for PPE, a good living wage, the need for Congress to pass the HEROES Act, and for this body to pass the important HEROES Compensation Act, which the National Urban League is very pleased to endorse. These are all excellent ideas. The Pandemic HEROES Compensation Act only works, however, if essential workers contract COVID-19 while employed. The economic data suggests that Black unemployment hovering near 17% will become more acute over time. Last week's May employment numbers do not suggest that the economy is moving out of the woods. Fiscal policy will be the main driver of economic growth in the early stages of recovery. We're still in a deep hole with 13.3% unemployment. Congress must take these concerns seriously and inject more fiscal stimulus into the economy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Roy. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Maloney, Vice Chair Gomez, Mr. Heiss, and members of the committee, thanks for inviting me to speak with you today. Chairwoman Maloney, I was a constituent of yours in the 2000s when I lived in Turtle Bay, and so I'm sorry we won't get to spend more time together today, and I wish you all the best with your health. The Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOP for short, is a nonpartisan think tank that focuses exclusively on ideas that can improve the lives of Americans on the bottom half of the economic ladder. On behalf of everyone in my organization, I want to thank all those who risk their health and safety for us every day. I'm grateful for the opportunity to hear from the other witnesses here today. I want to focus my opening remarks on 2 aspects of today's topic. The first is decisions by state governments that have endangered vulnerable seniors, along with the first responders who care for them. The second is how to ensure that the tens of millions of Americans who've been thrown out of work are no longer left behind. Of the 100,000 plus Americans who've died of COVID-19, the CDC counts 379 deaths among healthcare personnel and several hundred more in each of the occupational categories that we've discussed today. Each one of these deaths is tragic. An underappreciated part of this story is how many of these deaths occurred because of people who were sent to the hospital from nursing homes. 0.6% of the US population lives in nursing homes or assisted living facilities, and yet 42% of all deaths from COVID-19 have occurred among residents of these facilities. 42%. Some states recognized the threat early on. In Florida, hospitals pressured state officials to let them discharge COVID-infected patients into nursing homes, but Florida resisted. We drew a hard line early on, said Mary Mayhew, who runs Florida's health agency. I'm not going to send anyone back to nursing home, she told hospital CEOs, who has the slightest risk of being positive. What we said constantly is, let's not have 2 cases become 20 or 5 become 50. If you don't manage this individual as you return back, you'll have far more being transferred back to the hospital. Contrast Florida's approach with New York's, where from March 25th through May 10th, Governor Andrew Cuomo forced nursing homes to accept COVID-infected patients despite strenuous objections from nursing home operators and caregivers. They don't have a right to object, Cuomo said on April 23rd. That is the rule and the regulation, and they have to comply with that, he said. New Jersey and Michigan are among the other states with major outbreaks that forced nursing homes to accept infected patients from hospitals. California and Massachusetts initially imposed similar mandates, but reversed themselves after complaints from nursing home advocates. The other big policy mistake that we've made at multiple levels of government is the imposition of one-size-fits-all economic lockdowns. Hundreds and perhaps thousands of Americans have died in recent months, not due to the virus, but the economic disruption that followed. Not everyone is at risk of or equal risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19. As we've discussed, residents of long-term care facilities are by far at the greatest risk, as are first responders. Overall, individuals over 65 account for 81% of US COVID fatalities. Those under 35, by contrast, only account for 0.8% of fatalities. A more targeted policy aimed at protecting the most vulnerable could have saved millions of jobs and thousands of lives, and still can. At freeop.org, we've put forward a detailed plan co-authored by both Republican and Democratic policy experts that shows how we can safely reopen workplaces and schools and bring Americans back to work. Given the conversation that we've been having these days about racial disparities, it's essential to note also that the workers we have most left behind under economic lockdowns have been minority workers. In late 2019, Black unemployment reached its lowest rate in history, 5.4%. Today, that rate is 16.8%. Hispanic unemployment reached a record low of 3.9% in late 2019. Now it's 17.6%. In my written testimony, I detail how disparities between white and non-white unemployment rates have also reached their lowest levels in history prior to the pandemic. The economic lockdowns have brought those disparities back to levels last seen in the last Great Recession. But another way, racial and ethnic disparities in employment are worse when the economy is at work, and especially during the government-mandated shutdowns of the economy we are experiencing today. These disparities are in part due to the fact that Blacks and Hispanics are more likely than whites to be hourly wage earners. But Black-owned businesses have also been hit far harder than white-owned businesses. A recent paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research estimates that Black-owned businesses have experienced losses of 41% between February and April versus 32% for Hispanic-owned businesses and only 17%, relatively speaking, for white-owned companies. There's much more to say on these topics, but let me stop there, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to the question and answer segment of our hearing. Ms. Maloney is not feeling well, so I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. This coronavirus crisis has really reframed what we consider essential workers. In the past, we only really considered essential workers in people's minds, nurses, doctors, front emergency firefighters, police officers. That's what we've envisioned before. But during this crisis, we really did get a better sense that in order to keep people fed, keep people hungry, fed, healthy, make sure that they're safe. All of a sudden, the idea of essential workers has changed, right? At least in the public's mind. The transit worker, the grocery store worker, the people in the fields, the people that make sure that your kids are taken care of and that you can go to work. All of a sudden, the idea of essential workers has shifted. And that's what I think is something that we need to dig into more. That an essential worker is not just the people with the highest degrees, right? It's the people who are making sure that life can continue, even if you're locked down because of health reasons, because of a pandemic. And that's what I really do appreciate. Everybody who's on the panel, everybody who's out on the front lines. It's been an amazing thing to watch. So I just want to say first, thank you so much to all the essential workers, from the people in the fields to the people in the emergency rooms. You are making our life easier and better. And that's why since I've been during this pandemic, I've had town halls through virtual reality, just like we're doing right now. I had Facebook Live town halls with nurses from the United Nurses Association of California. It's a nurses union that I worked for when I was, before I ever got elected, with SEIU, United Service Workers West, to discuss their needs. What were their problems? What were they seeing? And a lot of it came down to basically PPEs, that they weren't getting the right equipment that allow them to do their job in a safe way, so they wouldn't be worried that they're going to take back the virus to their loved ones at home and get them sick. I want to just say that they continue to impress all of us with their work. Just for the record, I want to ask a few questions so that we can, I know the panelists have answered this question, but I want to do it in order. Mr. Costa, are you aware of any essential transit workers who have passed away from COVID? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Perrone, are you aware of any essential food and commercial workers who have passed away from COVID? Yes or no?
Yes.
Ms. Castillo, are you aware of any essential nurses who have passed away from COVID? Yes. All your workers have been putting their lives on the line. And that's what I want people to recognize, is that people have lost their lives. Even if you do not know someone who has lost their life to COVID, there are essential workers who have. And that is impacting not only their families, but their coworkers, and and leaving a hole in the fabric of their communities. Mr. Odom, how would you describe the economic burden on low-income workers and essential workers of color during this coronavirus pandemic?
I would describe it as a multi-layered disaster. Many families of color have one person who's supporting a household. We have, among communities of color, some of the lowest rates of multi-workers in the same household. So when one household member goes down with COVID, or is even under quarantine, or just waiting for testing to come back, that person is not making money, and that person can't support their family. And that's a double body blow, in addition to the high rates of unemployment that we also see in these communities. So we are both forced to work and are also first victims of layoffs when layoffs come, as they invariably have.
Thank you, Mr. Odom. Mr. Perrone, do food and commercial workers have death benefits?
No, we do not.
Do Ms. Castillo, do nurses have death benefits if they die from coronavirus?
No.
Mr. Costa, do the transit workers have death benefits if they die from coronavirus?
Some do and some don't.
So that's one of the reasons why we need Chairwoman Maloney's Pandemic Heroes Compensation Act. It would create a fund to cover economic losses of essential workers who become sick or pass away from coronavirus. These are just like somebody who puts their life on the line when they go into a fire or go into a military conflict and they lose their life. There's some death benefits for those individuals. So I'm in support, and I signed up as a a co-sponsor of the Pandemic Heroes Compensation Act, and I hope that we can pass that as soon as possible. With that, I yield back. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Heiss for your questions. You may unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Mr. Roy, let me go to you. One of the parts of this whole discussion that, at least in my opinion, we're not talking enough about is the Communist Party of China. There's no question they intentionally concealed the severity of COVID-19. And while doing so, they stockpiled a lot of medical supplies, PPEs, and a host of things that could have been extremely useful globally. And it's alarming to me. I'm looking at some stats that we came up with. They actually during this time they imported a lot of PPEs and different supplies. Surgical masks in China went up 278%. Surgical gowns up 72%. Surgical gloves up 32%. All of these while they were hiding from the world what was taking place and just how severe this could have gone. And we even helped. I mean, we sent them some supplies too. And obviously, a lot of these supplies could have been used to help many people who are on the front lines. And yet we did not know just how severe this thing was. So I guess my first question to you, Mr. Roy, would be, do you believe that we should act? Should we take some sort of action to ensure that China is held accountable for what they did?
Well, Mr. Heiss, I mean, I agree with your assessment of China's culpability, but I don't know what the tools are. I certainly haven't spent enough time thinking about what the tools are that we have, the leverage we have to request compensation or other means from China. I know plenty of people in Congress and the White House have been thinking about that topic, and I'm glad you are. I just don't have any specific recommendations for you on that topic, other than to agree that if there is a way to do it, let's do it.
Okay. What about on the issue of how China now is involved in some espionage, actually, even to go after some of our treatments, trying to find our vaccine research, as we are being told. At least they're targeting U.S. universities, pharmaceutical companies, uh, other healthcare firms in an effort to try to get really secret, sensitive information that we have, research that we have done related to the virus. Are you aware of that and what they're doing? And I guess beyond that, how harmful is that in our capacity to find vaccines?
Well, I have great confidence in the R&D infrastructure of the United States, both in terms of the university academic sector as well as private pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies to develop effective treatments and vaccines eventually. One thing we've written a lot about at freeop.org, my think tank, is that we cannot count on a vaccine being developed in the near term. We can certainly hope for the best, but the fastest vaccine for a novel virus developed in recent history was the Ebola virus vaccine, which took 5 years to develop. So this idea that we're going to have a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 in 12 to 18 months, look, let's all hope that that can happen. But if we're going to bet our entire economy on that, I think that would be catastrophically mistaken. We've got to figure out ways to reopen the economy and encourage R&D innovation at the same time, even if a vaccine doesn't immediately come forward. And then we have to protect our intellectual property if China tries to steal it.
Yeah, I mean, that protection of intellectual property is really where I'm going to. There are some companies that believe that we will be able to, in fact, get a vaccine hopefully early this next year. And it's pretty remarkable how rapidly our R&D in this country has moved forward to research and to come up with some treatments that are looking to be extremely helpful with this. But the protection of our intellectual property there is a major issue for me, and I'm just deeply concerned with what the espionage campaign that the Chinese are putting forth to steal that, and how that espionage campaign affects our ability to effectively do research.
Well, the way the patent law works is that the patent clock begins from the time that you file your patent with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And so if a biotechnology company or an academic university has developed some approach to developing a vaccine that they think is worthwhile, and they file the patent applications accordingly, by the time the Chinese get to it, the patents will already be on the timeline, on the clock, so to speak, in the U.S., and that will be important. So what's important to say is that for any people in the biotech community who are watching this hearing, if you've got IP, make sure you're asserting it.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss. Now I'd like to, Ms. Norton is now recognized for your question for 5 minutes. You may unmute yourself.
I hope you can see and hear me. It's not unmuted. I had done it.
You're good. Oh, you're muted
Okay,
again.
I'm sorry.
You're fine now.
All right, I want to begin by thanking our chair for this very important hearing and to wish her the very best as she is quarantined. And I certainly want to express my condolences to Ms. Ppe. In a real sense, this hearing is dedicated to her and her loss. I do want to say, because it was remarked that we should be meeting here in the nation's capital, I do want everyone to know that there is a reason that I think the chair has chosen not to meet in the nation's capital. If there are hot spots still, this is the hottest spot, the very last to open, and it's only squeaked open a very little bit. With the mass demonstrations that have occurred here because of the death of George Floyd, I'm not sure when the nation's capital will be open, so I'll depend on the best judgment of the chair. My question is for Mr. Costa. This region is the most public transportation dependent region in the country. Now, I know I speak for other members who are increasingly dependent on public transportation. We have electric buses coming on, and with climate change, more and more regions of the country are turning to mass transit of one kind or another, not to mention climate change itself, which has become central to a bill, and maybe one of the few bills that will pass this session. I am subcommittee chair of the committee that has just written a new transportation and infrastructure bill, which is likely to go to the floor this year. So my question is for Mr. Costa about public transportation, with the dependence of the country increasingly on public transportation. Not every region is set up to have trains of the kind we have in the nation's capital. And so buses, increasingly electric buses, are becoming more important. So I would like to know what you are experiencing as the difference between the effects of the virus on bus and train drivers at the moment, Mr. Costa.
The bus drivers are more exposed. Of course, it's a smaller vehicle, and the airflow on it and the filterized system needs to be redone. We need to look at that, especially on the reopening, because the airflow comes from the back. So we need to put a better filterized system in there. As far as trains, we are concerned there too with the airflow. Like in New York, they have made some changes there with the filterized systems and the UV systems they're putting in, because let's face it, even though they're in a compartment, when you open up that compartment and shut it with a lot of passengers on and the overcrowding, there's still a concern. So more of our exposure that we found is, of course, is on bus, but even the maintenance area early on with the cleaning the buses, we had some of our maintenance members pass away also, contracting the virus just by cleaning the buses because of the poor leadership in the PPE that wasn't given or educated to our members.
Mr. Costa, it looks like you're saying whatever decisions are made to reopen in a gradual way, that we ought to look first to transportation to see if the necessary steps have been taken there. And I would like to say to the chair of the committee that I believe it would be useful to speak more specifically to our transportation operators, about which I have not heard a great deal as we talk about reopening, because reopening, it seems to me, cannot occur unless our workers are able to get to work. And the testimony I've heard today from Mr. Costa does indicate that more needs to be done. Is that the case, Mr. Costa?
Yes, I am very concerned that I don't have to make any more phone calls going forward after 53 of my members have passed, co-workers and friends of mine, most recently one from Newark, New Jersey, and New Jersey Transit over the weekend. So there is a big concern, and I just hope the industry and APTA gets this right. I mean, the airflow is a big problem. We're going to have, the CARES Act helped. We kept the service on the road, which helped us with overcrowding. And now that we open up, we need to be cautious because we did experience, I believe, the most that have passed away so far is in the transportation areas. So yes, I'm very concerned with the reopening, and I hope everybody moves slowly and gets input from the transportation unions and operators at the table, and not just making determination as many of the management people are sitting home, unlike us on the road moving the country.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. Your time has expired. Mr. Gosar is now recognized. You're now recognized for questions. You're recognized for 5 minutes. You may unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? Now, I think definitions matter. Words matter. Something that doesn't seem to matter to the chairwoman is who's deemed essential. In your bill, Pandemic Heroes Compensation Act, you designate essential workers as those who can tap into the COVID-19 compensation fund. Who are these essential workers, you ask? Your bill designates essential workers as any individual, employee, or contractor working for a person, business, nonprofit entity, or federal, state, tribal, territorial, or local government that is determined during the response to the COVID-19 pandemic to be essential, based on state, local, tribal, or territorial orders, or declarations or their equivalent, or federal guidance published by the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, who perform this work outside their place of residence. I'm not going to sit through every individual scenario that we could make an argument for someone who is deemed essential, because honestly, there would never be enough time. My point is that who are we able to decide who is and who isn't essential? A job is essential by its very nature. Is it fair to say that someone who works a desk job isn't essential? Who could ask their children if they think food is essential? Food that their parents' desk job provides. We should not be in the business of micromanaging the economy and determining who is more important. I believe those who work to provide a good life for their family and to help sustain the economy are essential, not some random list of nonprofit employees that a government bureaucrat determines. Now, just like the ranking member, why aren't we talking about China? Where's the legislation to hold them accountable? We are discussing legislation that will cost trillions more in taxpayer dollars by sending money to an unprecedented amount of people. Why not allow? Why aren't we allowed to even question what is being force-fed down our throats? This is the same as the 9/11 compensation fund. Even though I support helping folks that were affected by that tragic event, not supporting every aspect of it was met with harsh criticism and dismissal. Let's talk about the real problems in this bill, like forcing already struggling business to stop at hazard pay. Are you trying to destroy small businesses? Honestly, because you don't even seem to show the slightest bit of empathy for those who take chances to start a business. No real cap on how much special master can spend on. I've been fighting for years to get compensation to folks in parts of Arizona that were affected by nuclear radiation from nuclear missile testing. But I guess since it wasn't pumped by the news all day, every day for 3 months, they don't deserve it. Now, on March 19, 2020, more than 600 physicians signed a letter to President Trump stating that, quote, millions of casualties of a continued shutdown will be hiding in plain sight, but they will be called alcoholism, homelessness, suicide, heart attack, stroke, or kidney failure. In use, it will be called financial instability, unemployment, despair, drug addiction, unplanned pregnancies, poverty, and abuse. End of quote. What are some of the long-term impacts the economic shutdown will have on our country? I'd like to ask Mr. Avik Roy that very question. What are some of the long-term impacts the economic shutdown will have on our country?
Well, if we have a long-term shutdown, we know from a lot of past experience and evidence that there's a significant effect, not just on the economy, but on mortality, illness, public health, deaths of despair, the number of people who either because they lose their job, lose high-quality health insurance, or because they have lower access to care, or because of other things that are going on in their lives or their children. So this is not merely a dichotomy between safety and public health on the one hand and economics and money on the other. If tens of millions of people are unemployed for a sustainable period, there are public health costs of that too, and that is widely understood in the public health community.
And going along those same lines, would not our veterans have the same type of outlook and the same type of problems?
Certainly, especially those who, well, I mean, for all the same reasons, yes. Short answer, yes.
Yeah. And my last question to you is that we found that the states and the public health aspects were behind the cue ball. There was a lot of misinformation. Some things that common sense would actually brought much more forward. Do you think it's time to make sure that we hold these mini republics, these states and their executives accountable for some of the actions?
Dr. Guther, yes. So in both my written testimony and my oral statement, I highlighted the issue of nursing homes and how nursing homes created a lot of the risk for first responders that we've been discussing today. Another thing that I should mention, we mentioned a lot about public transit, particularly in New York City. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio waited until May 6th to disinfect the subways for the first time. And there's evidence, there's research out of MIT that suggests that the New York subways were a major vector of transmission. We know that the tri-state area around New York City is the single largest outbreak in the country and indeed the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yield back.
Mr. Gosar, your time is up. Mr. Lynch, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. You may unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chairman Gomez. I appreciate you and Chairwoman Maloney and the ranking member, Mr. Heiss, for holding this hearing. First of all, I'd like to express my condolences to Ms. Ppe on the loss of your husband, Ed. I want to thank you for your willingness to appear at this virtual hearing and to bring it home in a personal and profound way about what the loss of your husband means to you and your family. I know that I have a lot of folks in my district that have had a similar experience losing a loved one, and just want you to know that I'm with Chairman Gomez and Chairman Maloney as an original co-sponsor of her bill to provide some relief to families in your situation. But I do appreciate your courage in coming forward and taking a tragic situation and trying to help others from suffering the same fate. So we really do appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit about essential workers and the hero pay that they have received. Some have fashioned it as a hero bonus. I've had an awful time here in the Boston area with my nursing homes. I've had 20, 30, 40 residents of nursing homes pass away, and the situation is so precarious that many employees, because they are traditionally low paid, many of them are men and women of color, they're low benefit jobs. They weighed that balance and said, I'm not going to put myself at risk, my family at risk by going to work every single day. For many of them, that hazard pay, that hero pay that was provided for by their employer was the difference for them. Some people, we lost about 17 employees at one big nursing home, and it just put more and more pressure on the others who were able to stay. And that hazard pay wasn't recklessly handed out by faceless bureaucrats. That was actually the management of those businesses that said, we need people to respond and to be on the job, even under these very difficult situations. So, in our state, and I know in many others, the governor's identified that we need to secure the supply chain for food. We need to secure the supply chain for healthcare. I spent a whole lot of time that I shouldn't have been spending trying to get N95 masks from China and other countries, to bring to my nurses and my healthcare workers at my coronavirus hospitals and a bunch of my hospitals in this area. Not only that, but first responders, my police, fire, grocery workers. So, this was really an all hands on deck situation. And I think the idea that Ms. Maloney has, she's the lead sponsor on her, Heroes Pay initiative is very well focused on people who are required and are deemed essential by the President of the United States and by the governors of our states as well. We know the systems that had to be secured, and like Ed Ppe, those people knew full well the consequences to our society and to the most vulnerable within our society if they didn't show up for work. Their response was heroic, and I see it every day, whether it's the nurses or my postal workers or UPS or FedEx. That the postal worker provides about 90% of the medicines and pharmaceuticals that are taken by our veterans. 90% of the drugs that go to our veterans are handled by letter carriers and postal clerks and mail handlers. And that's how, so that's a critical, essential service. It's not hard to determine who's essential here. Those people that are on the job every single day. So I applaud Ms. Maloney's initiative. I think we can work it out. I think we need to remember, and it's not hard to remember, Ed Ppe and his commitment. He sounds like a wonderful, wonderful man. And his service was heroic in Brooklyn. And I know there are a lot of his brothers and sisters in the SEIU 1199 that do that job every single day. And I think it's important for us to remember that. With everything
Mr. Lynch, your time's expired.
I'm sorry. Okay, I yield back. Thanks for your courtesy and your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course, of course. Now, Mr. Higgins, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our panelists for appearing virtually with us today. I'd like to say at the outset that that this 21st century technology that we're using today, or we're attempting to use, I think it's good that it's tested. However, I must say respectfully that I protest to the venue. I believe that this type of technology should be used for congressional business only when the U.S. is under very serious attack. I've said before that America has been impacted by a virus. We have not been invaded by an army. So I respectfully urge my colleagues across the aisle to encourage Madam Speaker Pelosi and the majority leadership to end proxy voting and remote committee hearings. The Senate is operating in person, the White House is operating in person, and yet the People's House, the House of Representatives, remains incredibly restricted, as we've seen by our efforts today, forced to use technologies that I believe is best reserved for perhaps never, but certainly for much more extreme national emergencies. Ms. Castillo, if I may talk to you for a bit, ma'am, I have a very high admiration for nurses and doctors, frontline medical professionals, and you gave a moving testimony regarding PPE and the lack of access to proper PPE. And I thank you for clarifying the difference, ma'am, between the effectiveness of an N95 respirator used for an hour versus a surgical mask used all day or longer. I'd like to have my staff reach out to you at a later date. Perhaps you could work with us on some projects that we have regarding PPE in the future. So I ask you, ma'am, regarding PPE, have you in your career, Ms. Castillo, have you ever seen such a massive demand for PPE at one time for medical professionals across the world?
Well, this is the first pandemic, and it's a global pandemic. So no, I have not seen this extraordinary need. The numbers are massive. That being said, we anticipated that this pandemic would happen, and we had plenty of warning. And so in January.
Let me ask you about that, if you don't mind, in the interest of time. And I greatly respect your testimony, and as I do your profession. And let me say that nurses and frontline medical professionals should have access to all the PPE they need: gowns, respirators, face shields, gloves, everything they need to get their job done. And your testimony has clarified what I believe to be true as well, and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we concur that as a nation, we will come out of this initial phase of this pandemic with a stronger infrastructure and a greater distribution of PPE. And I do think it's notable that that China as a nation and their government leadership purposefully delayed the release of important data and began gathering and hoarding PPE from across the world at a time when they were restricting our true knowledge of what was going on. So I would like to be able to work directly with you, ma'am, my staff, if you'd be willing, as we address the future needs for PPE. And thank you again for being here, and all the panelists. Dr. Roy, if I could ask you for a moment, sir, I'm particularly concerned if you would address the challenge to seniors in America because of the economic impact. There's nothing healthy about repossession, unemployment, foreclosures, eviction. Stress and depression are known killers, and loneliness is to be counted amongst that factor. And our elders across the country depend upon family interaction on a regular basis. Please, in my remaining few seconds, respond, if you would, Dr. Roy, about how you feel about what we can do to protect our seniors from this and how they've been impacted.
Well, thank you, sir. And I would say that, as I alluded to in my opening remarks and my written testimony, we needed to and still need to focus our attention, our energies on reducing the spread of COVID-19 among seniors, particularly vulnerable seniors in congregate facilities like nursing homes and assisted living facilities. If we do that, if we're testing everybody in those facilities, everyone who works in those facilities, making sure that the staff in those facilities aren't going from one place to another place to another place and seeding those other nursing homes. We have to rescind these mandates at the state level that force nursing homes to accept COVID-infected patients. There's a lot we can do on that particular policy area. And if we do that, we can restrict and suppress the spread of COVID-19 in the elderly population, because otherwise their economic activity and their social lives, their emotional lives, their family lives are going to be suppressed for a much longer period of time than everybody else's.
Yes, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for that answer, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence. I yield.
Thank you so much, Mr. Higgins. Mr. Connolly, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. And if Carolyn is still on this hearing, we wish you all the best, Carolyn, and hopefully the results come back not positive. I would like to begin on a personal note. I heard Mr. Heiss and Mr. Higgins criticize the decision to hold this hearing pursuant to the rule change in the House virtually. And like them, this is not ideal. I would prefer to be back at the Capitol and doing business as usual with my full complement of staff in the office. But let me say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, please stop making this a political talking point. This is about life and death. This is about people at risk. I lost a good friend of 40 years to COVID-19 2 weeks ago. 2 of my staff were diagnosed with it. I've got friends throughout Northern Virginia who've had to go to the hospital or stay at home and quarantine because they've been exposed. The chairman of this committee is in quarantine because she's been exposed and is awaiting the results of a test and not feeling well. Please, can we not once come together and admit that we're doing the prudent thing to prevent people from getting sick, to prevent members of Congress from becoming vectors of this illness and this virus? That's the motivation. And to subscribe baser motivations, to me, does a disservice to all of us. And I wish we would cease and desist on that line of argument and that political talking point. Mr. Perrone. Mr. Perrone?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And let me ask you a question. It may be a little bit leading, but it really struck me what you said about the fact that you know, frontline workers in grocery stores feel threatened when customers come in refusing to wear a mask, because those customers put them at risk and other customers at risk. And all of a sudden it becomes a more menacing environment. I know it's a political question, but one of the reasons it seems to me that that is going on in large numbers is because the President of the United States has himself decided that he will not wear a mask, and he's done it in a way that comes across as almost defiant and seems to send a signal to a large group of his followers that wearing a mask is a political statement and not wearing a mask is also a political statement. And the health consequences kind of get forgotten or diminished as a priority. Do you believe, Mr. Perrone, that the President of the United States not wearing a mask deliberately contributes to the situation your members find themselves in with respect to non-compliant customers?
Congressman, let me say the following. I think that it would be more helpful that in situations where he was in the public arena, like when he went to the Ford plant, that he would wear a mask just like everybody else would. I think that would be more helpful. I am hesitant.
If I could interrupt you, Mr. Perrone, I think it's a little more than it would be helpful. It's actually a requirement in the Ford plan. And
Well,
for example, when he recently went to Maine to a swab producing facility, because he didn't wear a mask, they had to destroy the swabs he was reviewing because of potential contamination. So that's more than it would be helpful. That's actually a violation of floor rules, and in the case of the Maine factory, actually requiring the destruction of the PPE he was there to look at.
Well, Congressman, here's what I meant by being helpful. It'd be helpful as it relates to the population so they don't necessarily think that it is political, because it's not. Look, this is science-based. This is not politically based, and it doesn't have anything to do with politics. Look, and my members, quite honestly, are tired of the blame game. Whether or not it's the blame game about having a hearing like this, or whether or not it's a blame game about who's responsible for the problem. Look, we have a virus in this country that is affecting people in a very negative way. There's no question about it. It's affecting them economically. It's affecting them as it relates to their health. It's certainly affecting certain people as it relates to the number of deaths that we've seen, over 100,000. And what I'm coming from at this point in time to represent my members is we need Congress and all our leaders in this country to act together to fix the problem that we basically have, or at least to do the very best they can.
Thank you. Your time has expired. Now,
Thank you, Mr. Gomez.
thank you for your questions. Mr. Massey, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. I believe that Congress should show up and do our jobs. If the nurses are showing up for work and the grocery store workers and the truckers are driving and the farmers are working, I believe we should be there working. Of course, I appreciate that we're doing this hearing online and remotely. It's much better than not having any hearings at all, but we know we could do a better job if we were in person. I do think it would be reasonable to tell our staff that they could stay at home, but we should, I believe, be leading the charge here. I am concerned about the workers at the meat processing facilities and whether they are getting the appropriate PPE and whether the policies have changed there, and then also what the effect is on productivity. And so I would like to ask Mr. Perrone, just to speak generally, maybe for about a minute, do you believe that we're getting the right equipment, the PPE, to the workers at the meat processing facilities? I've heard from the USDA early on, they told me everything was fine, and I wasn't buying it then. And I believe that these issues are going to be long-term, slowing down the lines or increasing the spacing may be a reasonable concession to preventing spread in these factories. Can you also tell us, what do you think it is, Mr. Perrone, about the factory conditions that make them one of the most likely places for somebody to have COVID or to get COVID outside of a nursing home?
I think that one of the reasons is much like President Costa mentioned earlier, as it relates to the volume of air in the facility, because they're in a processing plant, and there has to be a high volume air conditioning system in that facility in order to make sure it stays cool enough in there to process the meat. In addition to that, it's the humidity in the air at the same time that doesn't allow the virus or the particles, because they're aerosol, to evaporate very quickly and ultimately eliminate the problem. Now, you asked me about whether or not there's enough PPE inside the facilities. Look, because the conditions are so difficult in there, we had to do layered PPE that we had conversations with our, our management teams. Layered PPE meaning shields around the workers, face shields, and masks. Because if they just went in there with an NP95 mask that Bonnie Castillo talked about, the problem is the humidity inside the facility would ultimately attach itself to the mask, and it'd be like those workers were being waterboarded. So is there equipment that would be better in order to better protect them? Yeah, you could. You could go to an A100 respirator that might have the respirator pack on the back, much like you see in some of these biological labs that we've seen. That may be better. And then you could actually bring people closer together if you were concerned about the productivity, because you do have to have spacing if you don't have that higher level of PPE. So here's what's going on now. Do I think productivity has been cut down? Yes, I do. I think we're probably at anywhere from 75 to 80% of our full productivity. Our kill floors are operating around the same level as they were before, but not the processing locations, because the close proximity that you have to be in next to the person next to you. I don't know if that's what you were looking for.
Yeah,
but
no, I appreciate that.
that is what's going on in those plants.
And that's interesting perspective on the masks, that even the N95 may not be sufficient in those conditions. I hadn't considered that before. I am a proponent of any time that we wear a mask, as soon as we get the manufacturing pipeline solved, people should be wearing N95 masks instead of homemade masks, because I think it's doubtful. The science is doubtful on whether a homemade mask is really going to prevent the wearer from getting the virus, and it may not even be very effective in preventing those exposed to the wearer from getting the virus. So I'm a proponent of science-based and using the masks that are appropriate. Let me just ask Mr. Roy a question very quickly. Mr. Roy, I'm looking at your testimony here, and it really strikes me a few states have had a really high incident of COVID within nursing homes per 10,000 long-term care residents. Can you explain why that might be, Mr. Roy?
Yes. Hi, Mr. Massey. There are a number of factors, and we're actually actively researching this. And in some testimony I gave to the House Coronavirus Select Committee last week, I went into some of our analyses, our preliminary analysis. We tried to find correlations between nursing home fatality rates and other indicators, such as a high percentage of Medicaid patients in nursing homes or a high percentage of African Americans. And at the state level, at least, we didn't find those correlations. We may find more data now that the CDC is collecting data by facility. We can do more granular assessments. So I expect to have some analyses next week on that topic. But broadly speaking, what you see is that there's the two factors that stand out intuitively are: one, it's where the pandemic has been worse, but that's also related to the way a lot of those northeastern states in particular forced nursing homes and assisted living facilities to accept COVID-infected patients being discharged from hospitals. So those appear to be the biggest drivers, but that analysis is still ongoing.
Okay, my time has expired. Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman.
Of course, Mr. Massey. Now we have Ms. Wasserman Schultz. You are recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much. Just make sure my head is in the shot here. Over the last several months, I've heard from essential workers who've struggled to get the PPE that they need to do their jobs safely. And I've heard from nurses who are using homemade masks as they continue to treat patients, delivery workers without cleaning supplies to sanitize their vehicles, security workers who are on the job despite shortages of gloves and protective eyewear. And for me, those stories illustrate both the bravery and selflessness of the American workforce, and also the Trump administration's failure of leadership in a time of crisis. The Trump administration's lack of a coherent federal response to this pandemic, including failure to fully invoke the Defense Production Act to produce PPE, put a countless number of people at risk and cost others lives. I chair the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Subcommittee, and I focused on whether the VA has an adequate supply of PPE and is directing their facilities to distribute sufficient amounts of PPE to keep their workforce and veterans safe. Congress provided the VA almost $20 billion in the CARES Act, and with that money, we expect the VA to provide PPE for every person working in and entering Veterans Health Administration facilities. But just yesterday, the top health official at the VA admitted that they may not have enough supplies to withstand a second wave of the virus. So my first question is of Ms. Castillo. You lead an organization that represents 155,000 nurses, including nurses that work at VA facilities. how would you describe their access to PPE for your members that are working at VA? And also, would you say the experience of your members who are working at the VA facilities is similar to your membership more generally?
In the VA system, their PPE has been woefully inadequate. And when we talk about PPE, I'm talking about head to toe PPE. So in addition to the respirators, you need the head coverings, the shields, the coveralls, the booties, and all of that has been insufficient. And yes, it does mirror the private and public sector, the other hospital systems as well. We're seeing that throughout, including in the VA, where we've actually had to utilize donations too to get supplies to our nurses, and we have done that because we literally have had to fight for every, tooth and nail for every bit of PPE for our nurses.
Yeah, and I've heard that throughout, and I've just recently, Dr. Stone actually announced, went through the numbers, and my own staff has gotten the numbers. And if we have a second wave, if you're already struggling to keep up with the PPE you need, and then we have a second wave, there's going to be a very significant problem with keeping our workers safe. And so the Defense Production Act, what do you think about the president's refusal to fully implement the Defense Production Act?
It's cost lives. We actually need to fully invoke the Production Act, and we can. I mean, one thing that I want to say is we're dealing with a virus that is novel, and we're learning more and more about it each day. The PPE is not novel. We know what protects us, what will protect frontline workers, and what will protect patients. And we know how to make it. And so we need to have domestic production, and we need enough production.
Absolutely. It's grossly irresponsible not to have done that already. Thank you so much. Ms. Ppe, when we think about the shortages of vital supplies for healthcare workers, sometimes we tend to only think of doctors and nurses, but there are so many hospital employees that are not doctors or nurses. They're patient transporters, custodians, medical technicians, and they keep the hospital functioning. I'm talking about people like your husband, Edward. I'm so sorry for your loss. Can you describe his access to PPE when he went to work? And do you think that inadequate access to PPE played a role in his infection?
I'm sorry. Sorry, I couldn't make out what you said.
You couldn't hear any of what I said?
Just part of it. I'm sorry.
Okay, my question is, because your husband, Edward, was not a doctor or a nurse like they usually think of, Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind adding a few seconds to my time so I can re-ask my question, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, please ask your question.
Thank you so much. So what I referred to was that doctors and nurses are usually who are thought of as frontline healthcare workers, but people like your husband, who provide support to those frontline healthcare workers, also are a critical component of the overall delivery of care. Can you describe your husband's access to PPE when he went to work? And do you think that inadequate access to PPE might have played a role in his infection?
Yes. I think when it first started, he wasn't equipped. I think they were giving it to the doctors and the nurses first. As the virus started to progress, and I think people were taking it more seriously, they finally gave it to him. But I think by that time, he was already exposed. But I do think if he had the PPEs, he would have stood a chance of not contacting it.
Thank you. And again, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for his commitment to caring for people. Mr. Chairman, this is just unconscionable that we have left so many people without protection that they need, and so many lives have been lost as a result. And I appreciate it. Your indulgence. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, okay. First of all, for Mr. Costa, I'd like to thank you for the anecdote. I was not aware that the subways in New York were not being cleaned. And I just apologize for the failure of the government out there. It's between that and the nursing home thing. It's just stunning that people got stuck with such lemons out there. So I apologize for that. Secondly, I'd like to talk to Ms. Castillo. One of the problems I have in the state of Wisconsin, I love nurses. I love to talk to nurses. I think sometimes you find a lot more from nurses than doctors as far as what's going on in our healthcare system. One of the problems we have here is there was a fantastic overestimate of the number of people who were going to wind up hospitalized. And as the result, two things happened. First of all, a lot of non-essential medical things, which I would consider essential, things like putting a new stent, repairing a valve, were not done. So perhaps people are dying, and there's some evidence the reason for the uptick in the death rate in this country is things not being done which should be done, that should be done. And secondly, we've begun to lay off healthcare workers instead of nurses. I know that's going on in Wisconsin. Is that something that's going on in nationwide? And what can we do to get these, if it's true, what can we do to get these hospital administrators to bring back the nurses to work and open up these hospitals?
Well, I know as a nurse, we always want to, it's better to be prepared and to prevent. And so we know what we should have been doing in anticipation of this pandemic, and those that did, certainly, we applaud that. That being said, we do see some hospitals take advantage of this particular moment. And instead of focusing on ensuring that they have adequate protections for workers, they're looking at things like furloughs, making nurses cutting down their hours and or closing essential services like labor and delivery. In Santa Clara County, there's a hospital that literally closed down labor and delivery. And so there was a layoff of nurses. And, there's certainly mothers that are still needing to deliver, and now they have nowhere to go. They have to go
Yep.
many, many miles. So, we are fighting
Right,
back on this as
right.
well, because
I
there
I
was
hope
no
you all
reason
eat that.
to
I mean, the people who aren't
close
getting
that
mammograms,
service.
they're not getting colonoscopies, they're not getting screenings, other screenings for cancer, because the hospitals way overestimated the number of people who are going to be there. Now, I can understand a hospital doing that in March, but as time went on, it became very apparent that the so-called experts in Washington, overestimated things. And I just wondered if you are doing what you can to weigh in. And
In our mind, if we would have had adequate amounts of PPE, so in other words, that hospitals were required to have sufficient supplies, a stock, for example, for like a year, then, we would have been able to treat all of our patients. So in other words,
I'll tell you, and you can tell me this is true nationwide. I think in Wisconsin, the problem is not a lack of PPE. The problem was they were shutting down whole wings in anticipation of this deluge of patients that never showed up and laid off people for the
Yeah,
same
my
reason.
understanding is the shortage of PPE is nationwide, and that's from hearing from nurses where we surveyed nurses across the nations and had responses from nurses in 50
Right.
states
Okay.
who were
Next
actually asking,
question for
they were
Dr.
being asked
Roy.
to reuse masks, for
Um,
instance.
yep, yep. Dr. Roy,
Yes,
um,
sir.
one of the things that concerns me here is Congress has already spent far, far, far too much money on this, and we are driving the next generation very deeply into debt. In other words, it's kind of an odd thing. Usually you want the next generation to be wealthier than your generation. We're kind of going the opposite way. We're running up the credit card and making sure the next generation is broke. I certainly have a lot of people in my district who are financially harmed because of the COVID, and they wish they had their jobs. They don't have their jobs. They wish their businesses were keeping above water. Instead, they're maybe going through bankruptcy and wipe out their life savings. I wonder if you could comment on the degree to which we already are throwing money at so many different people, and on the other hand, the people are eventually going to have to pay it back. They may be going under bankruptcy because of this situation.
This is an incredibly big problem that we write about a lot in our freeout.org paper on reopening the economy. It's a double whammy, right? The economic destruction from the prolonged lockdown, the fiscal spending, that's actually a triple whammy, the fiscal spending that Congress is putting forward in order to compensate for the economic lockdown, and then the fact that the average small business has less than a month of cash on hand. For urban business, for minority-owned businesses, it's more like 2 weeks of cash on hand. So a lot of those businesses have already shut down permanently, and every week that goes by, more and more of those smaller businesses are going under permanently, which means that as we recover the economy, maybe some of those jobs will come back, but we'll have a much more consolidated economy with a few very large corporations running our economy rather than the more diverse and distributed economy that we all care about.
Thank you.
Time has expired. Mr. Grothman, thank you for your questions. Mr. Sarbanes, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and I thank the committee for pulling together this very, very important hearing on our frontline workers. As we've come to understand, there's this whole unseen workforce out there that doesn't normally get the attention it deserves, but in these circumstances, of course, they are in focus. And I think one of the big challenges for us as policymakers, and this hearing will help us in this challenge, is to start thinking about how do we continue to see this workforce on the other side of the pandemic. We are learning lessons now that we need to carry with us. And when we get back to whatever the new normal is that going to be a new normal that has the kinds of wages and benefits and workplace protections for this workforce that so many Americans have uncovered and come to know over the last 2 or 3 months? Are we going to continue to see that workforce on the other side? And I hope that hearings like this help us sort of fortify our commitment to that. So I want to thank you for the hearing. I also want to especially thank Ms. Bacote for her testimony. We certainly send our condolences to you, and we thank you for your courage in sharing your story. It's very compelling, and I think it will make a tremendous difference as we consider these issues going forward. I did want to specifically address some questions to Mr. Costa. I want to thank you for your advocacy on behalf of transit workers across the country. The ATU is a very effective organization in speaking up for those concerns, and I'm proud that your international headquarters is located in Maryland's 3rd District, which I represent. The frontline workers that you represent are a little bit different from other frontline workers in the sense that they are the folks that transport a lot of those other workers. So in a sense, you intersect with this conversation in 2 ways, and I want to thank you for what your members do every single day. We know that there's been a lot of layoffs as a result of the pandemic, and we know that, for example, in Washington, D.C., the ridership is down 95% on the metro. They're losing $50 million per month during the pandemic. Across the country, we know bus drivers and rail workers are being laid off. Could you speak to that a little bit, what the economic impact just on your workforce is? We talked about a lot of the safety issues, but if you could talk about just these layoffs and cutbacks, I would appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for the kind words. Yes, we are our headquarters in your district, but thank you. As far the CARES Act helped a lot in keeping the buses running, and I believe, as I said before, keeping the overcrowding from happening. Our membership is down about 10%. We've lost in furloughs or layoffs at this time due to the pandemic, and matter of fact, in this area, it's not, as the states are opening up, we are seeing overcrowding starting to happen and more people getting on the bus, which I voiced my concerns about that. but about 10% have left. The private sector is hurting us more. It seems like they didn't take advantage, or actually they're taking advantage the wrong way. They're not doing the right thing with the CARES Act money, and they're trying to basically utilize that money to put in their pocket or offset cost for profits instead of doing like many of the public sectors did, where they brought they listened to us and we educated them on what that bill meant, and by keeping the buses and the workers at work to keep the economy going and keep it stronger.
I'm sure that you are very apprehensive about what's coming as we get closer to July 1st, which is the date by which most states and most municipalities have to balance their budget across the country. As you know, the HEROES Act is trying to bring significant assistance to state and local governments in terms of their budgets. Clearly, that will have an impact, a ripple effect on your workers. So I assume that you are strongly in support of the HEROES Act and bringing that assistance to bear.
Listen, the budget crisis for the authorities is there. They're going to need help, and once again, I hope our representatives and our Congress and Senate does the right thing for the American jobs that are here, and focuses on operating assistance to keep the agencies afloat until we get out of this crisis and bring the cities back. So yes, in the HEROES Act, as I said before, very few of our members have a good insurance policies, and this would help offset the 53 members that I have, not to mention the TWU in New York, which is over 100 members that have passed to the COVID virus, would help their families and remember our fallen heroes that kept the lines going and keeping our nurses and doctors in there to help our country and our families stay alive.
Mr. Sarbanes,
Thank you very much.
the time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Comer you're now recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you having this hearing on supporting essential workers. I think there's clearly bipartisan support to support the essential workers that have been mentioned thus far, the healthcare frontline workers, obviously the people that are involved in processing food. We've seen outbreaks at different processing plants that have significantly disrupted the food chain, and we can't have that. So we all support that. But one group of essential workers that's been in the news a lot in the last few days that really haven't been mentioned during this hearing are our law enforcement personnel. And we're very blessed in America to have some of the best and brightest who work in law enforcement. And it troubles me deeply to see on the news movements in some of the cities and even references by some of my colleagues in Congress to defund the police. Of all the things that I've heard in my 3.5 years in Congress that I disagree with, that I think isn't very good policy, I think that the movement to defund the police is probably the dumbest thing that I've ever heard of. And it bothers me deeply because we have to have law enforcement, especially in times where there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of disagreement. We need to maintain law and order, and our law enforcement personnel put their lives on the line every day. So I want to go on the record, and I hope that every one of my colleagues in Congress will go on the record to say that we strongly support our men and women in law enforcement, and we certainly never want to defund the police. So I wanted to get that out there. Next, Mr. Chairman, I've been blessed the last 2 days in my congressional district. I've visited factories that are making PPE. These are businesses. One was an existing business that expanded their supply or their product line. Another's a new business that was formed that went into an abandoned garment factory, and they're making PPE. And I think that's great. I think that what we saw happen with China where they obviously misled the world about the coronavirus, and then they hoarded their PPE to use for themselves at the expense of American hospitals, American nursing home facilities, and American healthcare workers. So I believe there's bipartisan support in Congress to ensure that that PPE is manufactured in the United States. So we've got companies in Kentucky and all across the South and the United States that are willing and able and currently producing and manufacturing PPE, caps, gowns, masks, gloves, things like that. But they're still competing against Chinese companies. There are still different government agencies that are awarding contracts to companies that are manufacturing this PPE in China. I would like to extend an invitation to my colleagues across the aisle, my Democrat colleagues, to come together. And I would love to work with the majority party to see that we can do everything in our ability to see that this PPE is manufactured in the United States of America. And we don't have to ever depend on China, especially considering all the wrongdoing that they have displayed because of the COVID outbreak. I don't ever want to depend on China for that essential PPE again. And I think that that's something that needs to be discussed in this hearing, talking about essential workers. Uh, my my question that I want to ask is to Dr. Roy, and it pertains to there were proposals in the last bill we voted on that I voted against, but it passed the House, uh, would extend the unemployment an additional $600 a week past its current expiration date of July 31st. The Congressional Budget Office recently examined this proposal and found that roughly 5 of 6 recipients would receive benefits that exceeded the weekly amount that they were earning from employment prior to the COVID-19. My question to you is, how do the additional unemployment benefits shift the incentive from going back to work to staying at home?
Well, Mr. Comer, as you know, we've heard from many businesses that have said they basically can't hire workers. They can't reopen their restaurant or their retail store or their auto mechanic shop because their workers are getting paid much more to stay home than to work. And you can't blame the workers for making that choice because the disparities are so great. So that program was clearly designed very poorly, and it is my fervent hope that we listen to those proprietors and employers as we try to get the economy going again.
And I agree with that. Mr. Chairman, I have an op-ed that was posted by the Wall Street Journal that I would like to submit to the record, explaining exactly what Dr. Roy just said and the negative impacts that it's having on the states that are truly trying to reopen, and a lot of the businesses, especially in the restaurant industry, that are struggling to stay in existence.
Thank you, Mr. Coomer. I'm going to object to it right now because we do have a process of, I have reserved the right to object, so I do not intend to object in order to minimize the disruptions and to be fair to everybody. We requested that any exhibits be circulated in advance via the oversight clerk's email in the hearing notice. If you have not sent the item yet, we ask that you do so now. We want to ensure that we have seen the copies of all materials before they go into the hearing record. So I'm going to hold off on agreeing until after we ensure that we've received and seen the documents. I thank the member for the request. The member may be assured that his request will be dispensed with before the end of the hearing. So if you can email it, we'll take a look at it.
All right.
Thank you, sir. And now your time has expired, Ms. Lawrence. You're recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you so much for having this hearing. Since the beginning of this pandemic, communities of color has been disproportionately impacted by large numbers of hospitalizations and deaths. I represent a majority minority district comprised of 18 cities, including Detroit, Southfield, Pontiac. As one, also as one of the hotspots, not only in Michigan, but in the country. The African American community, minority community has been devastated by COVID-19. Communities of color, as Mr. Oldham stated, make up a large percentage of workers who are employed in essential industries. These essential workers are on the front line in hospitals, grocery stores, food processing facilities, and transportation services. My question I would like to direct to Mr. Odom: are there any solutions you would recommend that the federal government take and put in place to limit the disparate impact that the coronavirus has had on minority essential workers?
Thank you for the question. Um, and they're really quite simple. When there's a fire, we go to the fire. When there's an emergency, we go to the emergency. In the COVID space, we need to know, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing things like testing. We can't put our head in the sand or just have randomized testing. We've got to go to where we know the infection is, so that we can identify those folks, quarantine them, hospitalize them, get things going. That's one thing on the health front. We've also got to be able to implement a very rigorous tracing regime as well, both by human means and technological means. So we've got to be able to sort of find out where the disease is. This is all in the bucket of finding out where the disease is. Our economies have been devastated by what I call the self-induced coma that the pandemic has put us in. We've got to be able to support our businesses. Our businesses are the lifeblood and they're the biggest employers in our communities. We had a very uneven rollout. That's a charitable description of the Paycheck Protection Program. We've had an opportunity now to go back and try to fix that, to make sure that minority depository institutions and CDFIs are participating. And it looks like in the second round, the average size of the loan is going down. And we think that means that maybe those funds are flowing to where they need to be. So on the health front, let's go to where the disease is. On the business front, let's support these businesses. We've had rejection rates of something like only 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10 people of color who applied for PPE even got the loan. So we've got to do better in that regard. I could probably
Mr. Odom, I thank you for that. I want to take this moment as we're struggling in America right now with our race relations and the history of discrimination in our country, that so many things have been exposed during this COVID epidemic that we have lived through. First of all, healthcare disparity. Secondly, the small business disparity for small and minority businesses. The lack of access to capital that we actually legislated for. The unintended consequence was that it would not go to these minority and small businesses. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the PPEs, the essential workers. It is unbelievable that they were made to go to work. I mean, it was required. You're essential, so you show up every day. And then the audacity of some of these corporations not to provide PPEs, to the fact that the federal government had to give funding to ensure that our workers were getting the money. To everyone who lost their life during this pandemic, I just wanted to take this moment and say that my 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 humble condolences to everyone. In the Black community, we were devastated. There's so much grief, and people are wondering why there's such a outpouring. It has been layer upon layer upon layer. My last question, if I have the time, I want to ask about the PPE requirement. Do you estimate that the PPE requirement will be intact for the remainder of 2020? And if so, what recommendations do you have for Congress to help companies and their members with this expense? I want you to know that I have introduced the PPE Tax Credit Act, and what it is, it will give up to $25,000 tax credits for small businesses and nonprofits to provide the personal protective equipment. So I'm looking for anyone that can give me a comment on do you have any recommendations for Congress on how we meet this PPE requirement as we reopen?
Ms. Lawrence, your time has expired, but they can answer the question.
I think it's been said before that the Defense Production Act is a real key here. It has not been used very aggressively. It's only been used very sparingly. We've got to be able to get our production capability up to meet the need, and we can't really do it just based on the grace of these companies. We've got to pay them to do the work, but we've got to use that tool in the toolkit, just like we did for food processing employees, right? We need our food and we need our protection. Both are equally wise areas to use the Defense Production Act.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Mr. Perone would like to also answer that question, Ms. Lawrence.
I agree with Mr. Odom as well. We definitely need to add PPE to the Defense Production Act. It became very apparent to us that what was happening is that PPE was going to the highest bidder. And I do believe that we needed to provide PPE to our healthcare workers and our first responders first. However, because of that, it was being very difficult to be obtained. I know that I've got one large major corporation that is discussing eliminating masks and providing masks for its workers, where they've got over 400,000 workers. And if it's happening at a major corporation, that a Fortune 500 company, I guarantee you it's happening in smaller companies that we just got through talking about. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to answer the question before we go on to the next?
I'd like to say something.
Great.
This is John Costa, and yes, I think it was shameful that our government dropped the ball. It did not, and this president did not enact the Defense Production Act for all that in this country that went on the front lines for the nurses and the doctors. And I believe we could have saved many, many more lives. When this happened, we did our own. We took care of our own. And what should have happened here, we should have taken care of our own. We need to go forward and take care of our own and make sure we produce it here and put people to work here to protect ourselves. Shameful, this president, this administration let so many people die on the fact of not having the protection that was needed. And then later on said we needed it.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Any other panelists? No. Thank you so much for Ms. Lawrence for your questions. Now we have Mr. Gibbs. You are recognized for 5 minutes for questions. You may now unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the essential workers for all their efforts and the challenges they went through, and Godspeed. Hopefully this gets over and get back to normal. I also want to give my condolences to Miss Vicari for her loss, and we should never let those things happen again. I want to just mention quickly, Project Airbridge administration did the Airbridge to get PPE over here from Asia and elsewhere around the world, and also the Paycheck Protection Program. I think there's, it's pretty much unanimous, and plus we just passed the Flexibility Act for that. That saved a lot of jobs and a lot of businesses, and that's been a very good program. I think, Mr. Chairman, at some point we need to have a hearing about the role of China and their hoarding of PPEs and and also now their reports of hackers affiliated with the Communist Party of China targeting our universities and pharmaceutical companies and probably being difficult in the development of vaccine. During this hearing, I had I saw there's 3 companies this summer and next month or so doing clinical trials for vaccines. So that's going to move forward there. I do want to talk about Ms. Costello in her written testimony. She talks about reusing single-use PPE as a dangerous practice and increased exposures to nurses and so on. But then she also goes on to say that decontamination of disposable respirators has